be the focus for tomorrow's event at 10 o'clock. And then next week at 10 o'clock on the 10th, we'll have our third report in the series of 3, which will look at the potential and geography of land value capture and how that links to the government's new town stroke urban extensions agenda. So 3 reports, 2 today, 1 next week, briefing today, briefing tomorrow, and briefing next week. And so before I hand over to today's presenter and my colleague, Anthony Breach, who's the author of the private house building report, just a bit of housekeeping. So administrative error by us around the timings means that we'll run this briefing twice. So we're going to run it at 10 o'clock, obviously now, through until 10:29. And then we will run another one at 10:31 through until 11 o'clock. And I'll remind you that you are free to go at 10:29 unless you want to listen to Anthony twice, which you're obviously free, more than welcome to do. You may say something different the second time round. You never know. So that's what we're going to do. So apologies for a bit of confusion, but we're going to run it twice. So Ant's going to take us through the meat of the report. Obviously, there's loads in there. It's all on our website, centreforcities.org. Can't do it full justice, but he's going to take about 20-25 minutes. So the bulk of the 30 minutes will be taken up by Ant taking us through it. There'll be minimal time for questions. Obviously, you've got more questions for Ant. You know where he is online and on our website. So by all means, contact him after that. So Ant, over to you.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Andrew. Let's pop my slides up now. Hope everyone can see those. Is that working all right? Great. All right. So thanks everyone for joining us today. As I said, it's a kind of double bubble report launch from us. We've got both our private paper today and also our public paper also launched today. And there's obviously 2 private events today. But just to get started, the impulse for this paper was sort of recognizing that the debate on planning reform has moved on quite a lot over the past few years. I think there's now kind of a consensus the planning system is a problem for national economic strategy. The government has made it a really important part of their domestic agenda, but there's still kind of a debate about what sort of planning reform do we need to actually build the missing 4.3 million homes that have accumulated since the planning system was created. Now, if you look at what the government is doing, they're thinking about changing the national planning policy framework, changing housing targets, bringing back strategic planning, bringing back new towns. These are all kind of many beneficial, but these are all sort of incremental, small r planning reforms within the existing planning system, right? So they're all sort of quite familiar ideas or kind of winding the clock back a little bit to try and improve outcomes. That could be contrasted against what we're calling big R planning reform, right? So these are, rather than changes within the system, it's changes to the planning system or changes to a different planning system. So one example of this might be replacing the discretionary system we've had since 1947 with a new flexible zoning system, or indeed thinking quite strongly about the purpose and extent of the Greenbelt in quite a bold way. And it's not really clear yet, what would be the effect of either of these 2 different approaches, right? And which one is necessary for the government to meet its ambitions. I think we can test this by really thinking about what the logic of the small r incremental planning reform agenda is that the current system has previously worked. So has it? Let's test that. And as Andrew mentioned, we've got a new data source on house building. So my colleagues Morris, who wrote the public paper, also Xuanru and James, have led on this mammoth task to digitize house building statistics by tenure at the local authority level from when the planning system was created in 1947 right through to the present. So previously data was only available in this back to 1980. And now we've got a much better picture of where the private sector and where the public sector built houses at the local level during the kind of period of the planning system and its peak performance, and also of kind of peak public sector performance as well. And this data was made available by the LSE Digital Library. So that local angle really matters for answering this question on can the current system meet its housing targets, because the geography of the housing crisis has really changed since the planning system was introduced. So what these maps are showing is homes per person across England, with green counties being places where the number of homes per person is at the England average or above it, and purple areas being places where the homes per person ratio is below it. And you can see on the left-hand map in 1950, Primarily, housing availability is low in urban areas and in mining areas, right? We're talking about places like Newcastle, like Merseyside, Staffordshire, Derbyshire, West Midlands, London. These are all places with very severe housing crises, terrible slum conditions, maybe badly affected by the Blitz as well. These are places where, housing conditions are really very bad. In contrast, it's kind of affluent home county suburban areas have lots of homes per person, right? They have, there's quite a strong relationship between income and houses on the left-hand map. If you look on the right-hand map in 2019, that geography has inverted. So often many kind of current places that are still relatively poor, places like Merseyside or Newcastle, now have more homes than the England average. But actually, it's those affluent areas in the greater southeast that now have some of the fewest houses per person in the country, still including London. We've gone from the situation where previously housing availability was low in poor places to it now being low in expensive places. Now, was this because the private sector didn't build enough? Were they kind of greedy or stupid or, not trying to respond? No, actually, if you look at where the private sector has tried to build houses since 1950, it's really been in those places where housing conditions have got worse the most, right? That's where demand has increased the most as economic geography has changed and patterns of demand have changed as well. It's just they have tried to respond to housing demand. They just haven't been able to build enough. Now, I think you can sort of think about, well, when did this construction occur and kind of how can we kind of try and create a typology to understand these patterns and why not enough housing was built over time and the role of the planning system by looking at the entire 1946 to 2022 period by different categories. So we can sort of group each of these counties into one of three types. You've got your shire areas, which are most of your counties. You've got your metropolitan counties, your big cities like Greater Manchester or Merseyside or Newcastle. And you've got London as kind of the third outlier. And if you look at those shire areas, you can see that there's actually from the 50s right through to the 70s and 80s, a very large private sector house building boom. And actually, this is more important than public house building, especially certainly from the mid-1950s onwards. So there's a huge improvement in housing outcomes and living standards over this period in shire areas. This is driven partly by suburbanization, but it's really driven by the private house building, delivering new houses, particularly in these kind of greenfield, kind of low-rise, new suburban housing estates where people can upgrade from cramped housing conditions to much better housing conditions over this period. If you then compare that to metro areas, we see it's quite a different pattern. So not only is total house building lower, it's actually lower because private house building is quite a lot lower. So council house building in these areas is a little bit higher than the shires. There's a much more of a kind of a targeted public house building response on slum clearances, on demolitions, on new council housing in the big cities. But actually, private house building isn't nearly as responsive to demand in the big cities. We're not seeing the same kind of improvement to housing conditions and supply from the private sector in the big cities over this period, and it's remained pretty low since 1970s, ever since. And things are even worse in London, right? So even though kind of the big cities maybe have a little bit of a housing boom in the 1950s and 60s, this is just completely absent in the capital, right? So the private sector, ever since 1946, has never really built a significant amount of houses in London, and this has contributed to very, very low levels of total house building in London over the past 80 years or so, obviously contributing to the terrible housing shortage that the capital faces today. So one argument might be, oh, okay, this is just due to kind of, suburbanization. This is kind of a one-off hit. This is due to, low demand for the big cities during a lot of this period. It's actually, these are kind of secular trends. It's all fine. And kind of what we see when we look at the data in terms of when you compare those patterns of house building supply to demand, to prices, to land values, is that earlier in the period, there's actually a pretty strong connection between supply and demand in shire areas. So we're seeing it's in places like West Sussex, East Sussex, Essex, Buckinghamshire. These are all relatively suburban areas, or relatively kind of rural areas with lots of greenfield land, very few barriers to development. And house building from the private sector is quite high in these locations, right? There's a very strong connection between local supply and local demand earlier in the period, and this is fueling suburbanization. If we look forward to the present, that relationship has collapsed. So while previously there's lots of variation between different shires, depending on local patterns of demand in terms of private house building, By the end of the period, by the current day, there's pretty much no variation in house building at all. Even the patterns of demand are very, very different. So there's been this total disconnect between supply and demand through to the present, which indicates that while previously there may have been a connection between that there may have been very few planning restrictions in the shires at the beginning of 1947, the planning system probably tightened over time and became more and more restrictive as time went on, disconnecting local supply from local demand. In contrast, house building on the private sector has always been restrictive in urban areas since the 1940s. This is backed up if you look at things such as the Green Belt. So what this map is showing is this is looking at house building rates between 4 different types of area across England. You've got the Greater South East areas in green, and you've also got the rest of England in purple. And it's the Greenbelt areas marked in and local authorities which end up with some form of Greenbelt from 1950s onwards. And you can see that local authorities in 1950s in the Greater South East, so places with high demand, that when the Greenbelt is introduced in 1955, go from having a particularly high boom in house building in 1955. They're first in the country for house building of any of these 4 different types of local authority. 20 years later, they're last. So there's a gradual tightening from of house building in the shires, which is really driven by, at least in part, by the Green Belt and its tightening effects on house building supply. So the shires become much more restrictive over time, quite slowly. In contrast, we can see that if we look at urban house building, it's always more restrictive in urban areas, and especially the more urban your local authority is, the lower private house building. So again, by using this local data at and especially from earlier in the period where the data is very high quality, there's kind of an ascending hierarchy of urban authorities from rural districts, which are the least urban, through to London boroughs, which are the most urban. And there's this consistent pattern where the more urban your local authority is, the less private house building is occurring in these particular areas. So again, this indicates that the planning system is always more restrictive for urban house building than for shire house building. Again, another way of looking at this is to look at London in particular, where it's the only place where we have data from before 1946. And the introduction of the planning system in 1947 causes a collapse in private house building from which London has never recovered. While previously, house building in London was running at about 80,000, 70,000 a year during its boom of the 1930s. It's really struggled to hit even 40,000 at any point in the 80 years since, again, indicating the planning system is fundamentally more restrictive in urban areas. So, that's all kind of the history, so I think there's a pretty clear pattern where, urban areas are always more restrictive, shire areas become more restrictive over time, but again, thinking about the government's housing targets, if we think about those as the best case, the strongest periods of private house building by the private sector, if we simply return to that period, would that be enough to meet the government's ambitions on house building? Is simply returning to that with a small R incremental reform program, would that be enough to deliver on the government's ambitions? And the answer is quite complex. So in the shires, the government really gets very close. So if we think about the target of 372,000 a year or so, in the shires, we're looking at about almost 220,000 houses a year. 205,000 of that would be met every year if we simply wound the clock back to that 1950s, 1960s period, right? So simply going back to how the system used to work would be enough to deliver strong private house building in the shires. In the urban areas, though, it's quite different. Actually, we've been having a house building gap of about 60% in the big cities outside the capital, and an even bigger gap with London, which will be driving a kind of underperformance of national house building as a result of these targets. And the upshot of this is that while the government has this target of 372,000 houses a year, underbuilding in urban areas would mean we would miss that target by 91,000, even if we were performing at the best case for the planning system. So I guess if we map this spatially, we can see that there are some shires where we would actually exceed our targets, which are met in green, but quite consistently, it's the big urban areas, it's London, it's the West Midlands, it's Greater Manchester, it's Merseyside, it's Leeds, where the planning system has simply never delivered enough to meet its current housing targets. And this poses a really big choice for the government, which is that either if we want to increase house building in our cities, then we need to have quite a different type of planning system to allow private sector house building to deliver more of the heavy lifting in these big urban areas. Or if we want to keep the existing planning system to meet up the gap that the big cities will never be able to fill, we need to really double down on low-rise, suburban, car-reliant private house building, as that's the only thing that our current discretionary system can provide at scale. So again, this implication is that, small R planning reform as government's currently suggesting is simply not going to be enough. In terms of the 1.5 million house building target, we risk only meeting 1.1 million of that over the Parliament. So there's a really big choice which the government faces. It's going to have to pursue some kind of big R planning reform. That's either abolishing the green belt to double down on suburban house building, or moving to a flexible zoning system and trying to increase urban house building. So public house building will help, of course. We're not saying that that won't provide any role, but when you look into the details of it, the amount of subsidy required means that simply to close the gap in the big cities, you'd have to increase the amount of subsidy being put in by about 9 times. We don't think that's politically realistic, so you've got to go further on private house building and planning reform for the government's agenda to succeed. So our recommendations from the report are that we think that instead of doubling down on suburban sprawl, we think that we should instead focus on house building in our big cities. So we're arguing to replace the Town and Country Planning Act discretionary system with a new flexible zoning system. We think part of the way in which this has to be delivered is going further on devolution, and particularly thinking about economic geography as a principle for devolution, as we've set out in our recent paper, Economy First. We think that rather than taxing private house building to support public house building and affordable housing, actually is a really strong case for a shift back towards grant for public house building to help not just public house building, but also to help private house building as well. There is going to need to be some greenbelt release around railway stations in order to support kind of a bit of suburban expansion. There does need to be some of that. And we've calculated you could build about 2 million houses on less than 2% of the greenbelt around railway stations. But also there's a number of kind of smaller kind of anti-supply measures which were introduced under the previous government that this government is not currently looking at. Biodiversity net gain is currently quite a prominent one. There's a few others too, which we mention in the report. Thanks everyone. Very much looking forward to hearing some of your questions. Like I said, this is a double bubble report, and we have a third report coming out next week. If you have questions on public house building, make sure to join our event tomorrow with my colleague Morris.
Great, thanks very much. And we've got a couple of questions, but if you've got questions, we've got, I don't know, 7 or 8 minutes. So if you've got a couple of questions for Ant now, you want to put them in, or obviously you can contact him via various channels to continue the debate and look at it. And just to say, because there is so much data and so much to say, we took the decision to essentially split it out into a report on the private sort of aspects of house building and then the public. And obviously, as you can see from the way that Ant's talked about, we recognise and understand these two things are related, and in some respects, it is a common agenda. We also have more to say on that over time. But just in terms of just making it logistically possible to get it done, we needed to make some decisions about that. So we're not treating them separately in our minds, but we are in the report. So that's probably helpful. Okay, so a few questions coming in, Ant. So he's just going to quickly run through them. One from Nick Corker. She said, is it the planning system that has restricted housing supply in urban areas, or is it lack of available land? Not sure if this is the same sort of thing. And I think that's because we hear quite a bit. We actually, if you looked at the BBC story yesterday, lots of places saying we just don't have any land available to build homes. Whether that's true or not is debatable. But there's a question where density and the change of the urban form is actually quite a significant thing. So just answer that question, Ant.
Yeah, sure thing. It's a great question. I think this kind of gets to the heart of the problem, right? This kind of idea that urban house building since 1946 has either been super bespoke, tiny kind of architectural, almost art projects, or it's been these areas in which a former industrial estate or a former council estate has been identified at an enormous amount of house building, these huge high rises are going to be delivered on these very specific plots that have been deemed acceptable for development. Whereas the vast majority of the urban form is declared off limits implicitly to any significant urban change, even demolition and kind of replacement at sort of a story or two. It doesn't happen in this country. This is a huge part of the reason why we have the oldest housing stock in Europe is we don't have this replenishment and this change. And the argument we're making is that a shift towards a zoning system by having spatially bounded rules-based decision making where we say, you can have suburban houses over here, but you can have change up to mid-rise over here, is you would dramatically increase the amount of developable land within urban areas. And because you would have much more certainty and rules that would determine decision making rather than these kind of implicit judgments that are being made by the current system.
Yeah, and it's important to kind of stress that if we think about this seriously, we're going to have to add to the existing urban form in places, but we're also going to have to change the existing urban form. It's not just rolling it out and out and out ever and ever, which is part of your critique. It's actually changing the urban form to a degree that we've already got. Take this question from Louise Thomas, and it says, can you point to some good examples of flexible zoning? The answer is yes, and there are quite a few of them, but go on.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, you can think of zoning systems in parts of the United States as being quite inflexible, right? It's really facilitating some of the sprawl that we're critiquing. But we're seeing kind of big changes in the US that are making their planning systems more flexible, so giving greater envelopes for development and change, allowing more mixed use. But by far the most important example worldwide at the minute is Auckland in New Zealand, where they've implemented quite significant planning reforms over the past decade or so. They've had an absolutely kind of very solid argument, like evidence-based kind of record now, where planning reform equaled more house building, equaled cheaper rents and cheaper house prices. It's kind of absolutely the gold standard, I think, for these sort of reforms all around the world. If we had something similar, we would have the same effects.
And in spirit of treating different issues, so Jack Fleming's asked a question around what are the downside risks of shifting to a zoning system? And we're not advocating or arguing that it's a guaranteed when you have to do something things in addition. I'm conscious that zoning in the UK, perhaps not flexible enough, has led to a missing middle of mid-rise and moderate density housing. The middle missing, which is much talked about in the housing world, with only high-rise and then suburbs and not very much in between. So just say a little bit about what you would need to keep your eye on if we did shift to a zoning system and we didn't get to avoid some of the outcomes that we get in other places where they've had less desirable outcomes. And
yeah, absolutely. So then, how national government would then draw up the zoning code would be really important if we move towards a zoning system. It would absolutely be possible to write a really inflexible code where you get exactly those kind of outcomes. We see this in the United States. It's very, very regressive and restrictive. It might even be better than what we have now because it is that kind of doubling down on suburban sprawl. But it wouldn't be ideal, certainly from our point of view. So the details would really matter. I guess the flip side to that is that it means then that planning reform would be quite structured around debates about what the zoning code says and then how that zoning code is applied. Whereas now we have quite a fraught debate about planning reform where it's sort of all or nothing. We're arguing about targets. We're trying to bully local councils to get stuff done. And it's all very toxic and all, very unpleasant and not particularly efficient. So I think, even if there are kind of downsides, I think there are possible risks that could come from move towards a zoning system. Even in terms of that politics, I think there are upsides too.
Yeah. Let's take one more question. We've had a lot of questions asking specifics. I do encourage you, we won't be able to answer them all, but if you've got that question, ping it in an email to Ant. He does like talking about housing, so he's definitely going to reply to you in terms of the questions. Particularly, you're asking for some more detail on the data and the analysis, as well as some of the definitions. A lot of that is in the report, but equally, I'm sure Ant will reinforce that. So let's just take one more. And so this is from Joseph Blinkensop. So he says, very timely report, government's MPPF changes, brownfield passports, etc. On the urban point, rather than introduce new legislation, could the new NDMPs, the National Development Management Plans, be used by government to introduce a flexible rules-based system while still maintaining LA oversight? Ant. technical, but nevertheless
Yeah,
very
I don't
important.
like some questions. I think what's interesting about this stuff is it shows the government is kind of quite aware of the problems of building in urban areas and is trying to think quite hard about the political challenges of doing that. I think it's fundamentally really hard in the current system to shift towards a kind of more spatial system because the legislation is simply not set up in that way, right? It's all based around kind of discretion, around material considerations, and judgment and interpretation. I think it's really hard to then sort of retrofit that into a spatially bounded, rules-based um, planning system, partly because the current system we have isn't very spatial, right? It's thinking about sort of principles and policies and judgments and harms rather than, well, in X neighborhood, you can do this, and in Y neighborhood, you can do other thing. So I think you do need quite big primary legislation, I think, um, to move towards this kind of zoning system. But I think the fact that the government is in this space, I think, indicates that there's probably more appetite than for at least considering these ideas than of what you might seem from the outside.
Yeah, and not so much in this report, but in definitely in the other work that we've done. We've also set out how you can run a sort of two-track approach. You can be doing big R reforms that will inevitably take a bit of time, whilst also doing a bunch of like small R reforms that will actually boost the rate that we see both in the private sector and in the public sector. So it's not an either or where we have to hold everything in check. That fair, Ant?
Yeah, that's right. I think there's plenty of incremental things we can do. NDMPs, my favorite reform that the government should be introducing.
Yeah.
I'm very excited for when those come out. But we have a paper coming out as well in the new year, thinking about from that legal standpoint, what would a zoning system need to actually do
Yeah.
in law to get that kind of these outcomes that we want.
Great. Okay, so we need to pause. So, as I said at the start, because of our administrative errors around time, and we're going to do this twice. So usually we cut the feed, and you have to leave whether you want to or not. In this instance, we're going to carry on the feed. So if you've had enough, you've listened to Ant, he's going to say,